Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that are found in Jesus. We thank you for the encouragement that we draw from time shared together. We ask as we study the Bible this morning that you help us pay keen attention to the details and to the specifics of your word as it relates to first the story of God's people, but importantly how it explains you to us and how our lives can become more fuller and more complete in our development of faith. Help us as disciples to be willing to confess our sins before you, and we know that you'll forgive them. We offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as noted before, as we continue in our study, we are right now looking at some capstone activities, some closing activities of the literary record of God's work with Israel. That literary record and account includes both some of the prophesied historical components, but most of this literary section comes from the prophets, where they're telling us of what God's intentions are. It's important to note that when we think about the divisions of the Bible and the way that we kind of break it up, there are a couple of categories that people have used historically, but mostly we're thinking in terms of the writings. Those are the books of history. We call those the writings. You have wisdom literature, things like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and then you have the prophets, whether they be what we call the major prophets or the minor prophets or the 12. All of them, whether it is wisdom literature, the writings, or the prophets, have an edge or a portion that would be included as history. So they have all of these pieces layered together in them. Even if it might be at times obscure, hard to figure out. In particular, the wisdom literature's historical sections are a little harder to connect to. But they're all there. They all have those points for us. So as that closes out in the biblical accounts, we're thinking mostly about the reconstruction of Jerusalem. And remember, last week we identified, and I've mentioned this a couple times before, that this cycle comes in a series of 3 events or 3 things. Let's see if I can find the, here we go, spot that I'm looking for. So 3 and 3 is a way to think about how these aspects work together. What we're thinking about is 3 steps of captivity and 3 steps of return. Now, these are approximate in the sense of it's not like the Bible creates this trough for us to walk through and says there's not a lot going on there. But the Bible does present to us that this is, in essence, what happens. And so it goes from around 605, moving into these kind of aspects, thinking particularly about the final captivity of things, and then it moves outwardly into the return settings. And so from Daniel to Nehemiah is our focus in this area. And with that, then, we think about our first return as our transition place. First return has our disciples of God who are now motivated by layers of change in their return. A lot has happened to them with their faith, their practice, their approach to God in this shift. Some of the things that have happened, obviously they have now been for 70 years disconnected from temple worship. How many of you have worshiped with a congregation that over the course of its period has adjusted its times of assembly? Whether they go upward, downward. You guys been in that experience before? I'm raising my hand. How disconcerting is it right when that happens? Let's say they went, like in our case, they went from a Wednesday night Bible study to a Tuesday night Bible study. You guys feel a little weird when those time shifts, even if it's just like an hour in one direction. Like, I'm anxious. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm confused. Now that's with knowing what's going on. Knowing our entrenched habits exist for a lot of reasons. A lot of it's just adjusted to habits. Like I feel like I should be doing this right now, and I'm not doing this right now. Even us, we just did that, right? We went from Wednesday to Thursday, and then Thursday to Wednesday. It's weird the entire time. Ain't nothing normal about it for our habit seeking. Now you have 70 years of no habits. Generations. Rise and mature. No habits. Well, no, we don't. We should go down to the temple. We should go down, but we can't. Or no conversation about it. Whatever those things may be, you have a whole basket of people who have no experience. And so as they're making a committed return to Jerusalem, they don't come with the benefit of positive habits. Even as much as we might think, they don't have the bad ones too, they got none. So they're having to reestablish more than just the walls. More than just the temple. And you notice in the prophets, the 12 in particular, when they talk about these events, they put as much effort into describing the success of build the walls, build the temples, eventually, the temple aspects, eventually rebuild their houses, as they do explaining. And then, we spent time reading the law. We recommitted ourselves to the covenant, etc. And so there's a whole layer of things that bring back this picture of these are important matters because they're going back into this adversarial space. Conflict is going to take place, and the conflict that we tend to focus on the historical side is all the nations around them working towards their demise. That gives us one plane of existence. The physical plane. Something we have to remember, and it's especially articulated in the prophets, is that physical plane is not all that there is. So if you think of the major prophets, how many times did they work with either the sons of the prophets, that's a school of prophets that surround the prophets, a mentor-mentee relationship? How many times did they explain to them that, hey, you might see this level, but let me show you what God shows us? Did Isaiah do that? It's a regular thing, right? Look at all of God's army arrayed. I'm not alone. God is with me. You and I live in a world that is very much rooted in a whole world system that says, that's all that there is. Just the dirt, what I can see. When you're reading these Bible stories and you see the conflict between Egypt, Assyria, Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Roman Empire, God's people are always the minor party if we only see the physical things. When you consider the army of God, which is part of the consistent picture, God's people are never alone and they are never the minor party, although we feel that way. So look at these texts and realize God is telling us more than just a history. He's telling about his success with a people who feel like they could not be successful. And so when these various kings come into play, God is continuing to support his people as needed. There's constant support in the story. Constant encouragement. You think about that when you think in this first return. We talked about this before, where there is a pushing of an edge of the kingdom, and it's from that kingdom that kind of works this way all the way westward across the expanse. Darius is capturing these new communities and these new places, and Judah is then just a small speck of that massive kingdom. For our visualization, about a month and a half, actually probably about 3.5 months ago, relative to Georgia, how big is the Palestinian space of antiquity, of Israel and the little edges? What are some ways that we can think about that using Georgia? Is Georgia bigger than or smaller than this little circle section on the map?
Georgia's larger.
Georgia is bigger. Yeah. And if you were to drive from Dan to Beersheba today, that's from the top part to the bottom part of Israel, you probably leave Coweta County, maybe go out to Athens, go to UGA. Definitely would take you longer to drive from Sharpsburg to Athens than it would take you to drive from Dan to Beersheba. Those two drives, because of how much traffic is involved in there, you have to go through Atlanta, right? So if you're starting to think and capture and try to picture this, this is not a large area. It's not a large space in the sense of world spaces and nation spaces. And so every time you're looking at the map, realize, okay, now I have a clearer visualization of what's going on. And now I can kind of think about what's going on with these various kings as these returns start to bear out. And then we have a story of Esther that comes in this historical space. Not going to go into a deep dive in the textual aspects of Esther at this time. We'll probably do that in the future. But I want you to think about this. On top of your head, is God mentioned in the text of Esther? Think through it. Also think, why would I ask that question? This is test-taking skills. That's a tell. So the answer is no. God is actually never overtly mentioned at all in the text of Esther in the ways that we think about it. Esther, Mordecai, all the participants are living in a God-encapsulated space, right? This is a story that takes place in captivity. They are engaged for the people of Israel. Remember, no temple, no tabernacle, no connection to the consistency of spiritual activity, not even a hint of synagogue connection in these communal contexts. And the story exists of Esther saving her people. And the dialogue we tend to lean into, one that we sometimes quote both in context and out of context, such a time as this. Maybe I am here for such a time as this. That's really the time where we kind of think about how God is interacting, is that she is committed to something very far removed from her experiences. She's committed to a people who no longer have a rooted sense of an identity in the way that the world around her thinks about identity. Land, physical structure, etc. And she follows through. And as does everybody else, continuing to leverage forward. And you think about that phrase again. That phrase is from Esther 4 and verse 14 as it unfolds for us. It serves in a middle space between these kingdoms to a degree as well. But it also then connects to the edging of our second group of returns. So we had our first group come out. Now we have our second group come out. Ezra is now shifting the focus from physical towards spiritual in a little stronger way. Ezra is a teacher and a scribe. And so anyway, they got scribes still, they got teachers. But it's interesting because their access to the text is now marginalized. They don't have as full of a connection, of a capacity to have large volumes of biblical text around. How many of you have more than one Bible in your house? So you've got more than one. How many of you have more than one Bible on your phone? Okay, I'm a nerd. Like I have a copious amount of available Bibles on my phone, right? If you own one physical copy of the Bible, you are now one of the richest people in antiquity. If you go back in time with your physical copy of the Bible, apples to apples, to actually have a physical copy of the Bible in your own language, you are a bazillionaire by every standard, because that's how expensive and rare they were to be not only a physical copy, but in your language. That translation level was nearly non-existent. To go from the Hebrew into Greek for the Israelites of this era, they used 70 scholars to translate it from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. And then they had to hand scribe it out and those hand-scribed out sets of scrolls would have easily stacked up to a nice big pile on this table if you wanted to have the entire Old Testament. And to own it, bazillionaire, by every standard. There's so few copies of it available because of the amount of effort to produce. In that space, you have Ezra, who has some access to the scriptures as a writer. So he's either in high authority, or most likely would also think he probably has a patron, someone who is willing to pay him to do his job. Very common. That's the normal method of allowing academics to work in old eras, antiquity. Someone paid their wage. They worked for them, but not truly for them. They worked for the greater good. But in this process, he's allowed then to go out and buy whatever he needs. And he's able to get about 2,000 priests and Levites. So I want you to think about this group as opposed to the first one that goes out that's not the same groups of people. This group, priests and Levites, they understand the law. They understand the context of the law to a higher degree than others might. Are they going back to being able to get land? Do they get their 40 acres and a mule in this arrangement? Remember what are priests and Levites supposed to own? Nothing. So they're not going there to homestead. If they're legitimately following after God's expectation, are they going to have real power? That's not whether they actually did or not. But if their intent was to follow God's will, are they going to a position of authority where they can tell slaves what to do and wage war and gather physical goods? They're going for service jobs. And the kind of service that is unpleasant. Yeah, you're going to be sitting over the sacrifices for a good while every day, and it's grueling work, and you're covered in the aspects of your work at the end of the day, and you smell like you've been doing that. That's what you're going to do every day. You're going to be doing that, or you're going to be teaching people about God. Those are the two responsibilities that broadly fit the priests and the Levites in a practical sense. So here's the thing. Ezra's mindset was focused heavily on, my heart is prepared to do this task. I want to do this work, teach those statutes and ordinances in Israel. We have a people who do not know God. They are going to learn to know God in their return. And so he's going to go assist in this. This is a group that's going to come back and restore worship together. Again, no habits. They have whatever they brought with them in knowledge when they left into captivity and whatever they could find therein in the Word. That leads us to our third group of returns. Nehemiah, a cupbearer to the king. Basic job, what's a cupbearer do? Cupbearer, Bobby, what's he do?
He would taste the wine before the king tasted it to make sure it wasn't given.
That's a very specific aspect of it. It's not all of it, but it's a big part of it.
Taste it, make sure it's not poison.
Right, now the poison aspect of it, but it's also one that is a position of responsibility over everybody else. He is the last link in the chain before that happens. And yes, he does that basic task. Through history, we think about that. But he's also in charge of everyone who does that process up there and brings it. Because he has to, because listen, are you the cupbearer? Are you not going to want to make sure that what you're going to drink is good too? You're not just up there as a canary in a cage. That's the old job the canaries did in the mines to make sure that there was no gases that would hurt the miners. Cupbearer isn't the canary. Cupbearer is in charge of making sure. So not only does he do the task at the end of the table, he ensures that what he's going to drink, which is also what the king will drink, is going to be safe too. And he's got the ear of the king. If you're going to have to trust somebody, you got to trust somebody. Right? And he's right there. And you can see that in how this plays out. Because think now for the other end of the table, you're king, and you've got a reliable cupbearer. does a good job. Do you really want to replace that person doing that job? Not really. And what kind of trust do you have to have in a person to do that specific job when on the regular kings get assassinated? Think back in just Israel's, remember, small country, small part of antiquity. How many of those kings died in their sleep? A lot of them or very few of them?
Very few.
Very few of those guys died peacefully in their sleep of old age in a quiet context. Well, the majority of them, especially the awful kings, which is like 90% of the kings, were killed by one of their family members. They were stabbed. They were run over, stabbed, and stabbed with a rock. Like layers of things, of awfulness. And so having someone you can trust close to you is vital. But to let them go is surprisingly trustful as well. Because they know things. It's not just, if I don't let them go, they're going to poison me. It's, they know how the whole system works. They know every ounce of how I am protected by this group of people. And so there's some layers to think about in the relationship that takes place that then allows this work to go forward. They have a temple. The city itself, not so good. Not great, right? They have the building blocks of things. If you remember, in the destruction of Jerusalem, it's razed to the ground and burnt. So substantially so that what was once solid, foundation stones, they used the process of heating them up and then cooling them off to shatter the rocks. What was then built afterwards was built of those shattered rock pieces. They took the rubble and built it together as a wall, where it once had been stone block. This part of the text in Ezra is one that a lot of times we pay attention to, of what can be accomplished in 52 days if you put your mind to work. That's a great illustration on a practical level. 52 days isn't that much. Folks often will ask me when I'm sitting down, like, hey, how can I get through this? How can I suffer? Like, this is a really bad situation for me. Like, remind yourself, you could probably endure anything for a day. Like one day, you can endure that. And remember, one day's enough. God tells us, hey, one day is enough trouble to worry about. And if you can do it for one day, you'll soon figure out you can endure it for 2 days. Now, if you turn the tables and say, well, if I can endure the awful parts for 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, what can I accomplish in 52 days? Amazing stuff, including, in this case, rebuilding of the walls and protection of everything. And the reason behind this is that lots of these people had shifted their priorities. This happens all the time. My boys and I did Boy Scouts together for a decade and a half, it feels like. Probably about right. And uniformly, the rule of thumb is when you arrive at camp, you set up the communal stuff first and your tent second. Your camp kitchen goes up first, that everyone shares. And then after that's done, you can go traipse off and set up your tent. Because if it goes the other way, the communal kitchen never gets set up. 100% of the time. Everyone's little campsite looks perfect. Kind of. But the kitchen isn't set up. And then the morning comes and everyone's cranky because there ain't no food. That's kind of what happens here. Everyone's like, well, my house doesn't have a roof. Yeah, but did you realize that with no wall, you're not going to have a house very long? We don't think that way. We do the same thing for ourselves. And the Bible is showing us roughly in this historical period how that kind of plays out. Ezra and Nehemiah then are paying attention to this from their two different lenses, and they identify some of the problems. Some of them had to do with their relinking themselves back into the land. I want to pay attention to this particular part of the text in Nehemiah's message regarding what we would consider spiritually mixed marriages. It's not about the ethnic aspect, because these are all actually from the same ethnic groups. They have a lot of the same bloodlines. And the bloodlines don't matter because you see proselytes come into the relationship with Israel all the time. The whole lineage of Jesus is full of people who shouldn't be there. The issue isn't that they're from other nations. It's that their religious practices were apostate. And that's the real concern. And it's highlighted in the context of this text as being part of the reason the spiritual work is not taking place. This is not happening, and so they uniformly agree to do something incredibly hard. End of marriage. But there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's nothing in that text that says, oh, it's so easy. Even the hardest hearts recognize that this is going to be a challenging outcome, but it helps you kind of catch two things in this text. One, the level of commitment that they were willing to give, higher than they thought, and the level of commitment God was seeking from them, higher than they understood when they started, or at least when they regressed to. And they follow through with those plans. And at the end of each of these steps, Jerusalem is now rebuilt. Again, the text had told us before, when the temple was finished, and even when these walls are rebuilt, it's not like it was. It's not as nice as it was from the earthly standpoint. During the reigns of David and Solomon, wealth flowed in to Israel. Kind of like it did in Egypt when Joseph was there. But through rebellion, spiritually, through interplay internally, all that wealth, gone. Not a lick of it was there in that regard. They had some, but not by the scale they did before. And so they do rebuild the walls. It's different than it was before. They do re-engage with God spiritually. And they're reminded, just as it had always been, if they are faithful, God will continue to prosper them and bless them. It's a promise that was made even to the kings that were rebellious from the unified Israel. Today, look, if you still stay faithful, God will keep his part of the covenant. You will not necessarily be part of the line of kings that will lead to the Messiah, but I will take care of you because you are still my people. And you think about Ezra's prayer, and this is in Ezra chapter 9 and verses 6 through 15. A couple of key things that come up in the prayer. Ezra says, our guilt has grown up to the heavens. We've been very guilty. Identifying there in specifics, perspective. Eventually, though, he says, grace has been shown from the Lord our God. God is making this happen. Continue to do so, in essence, and enlighten our eyes. Again, because we have forsaken your commandments and our evil deeds, and for our great guilt. Goes back and says, you are righteous, for we are left as a remnant. Here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can stand before you because of this. Ezra's great prayer there sets some basic categories of interplay between man and God. An acknowledgement of guilt, a recognition of grace, and an acceptance of God's capacity and power. Because we know we really don't have a right to be here. But we know you're a gracious God, and we know you'll allow us to be here. That's in that big capstone of what takes place. Thinking about the restriction of a physical position. The big deal in the return of God's people to Jerusalem is not that the walls are rebuilt. It's not that their houses are rebuilt. It's not even that the temple is rebuilt. The big deal is capsulized in Ezra's prayer and the interactions of Ezra and Nehemiah, that they are rebuilding a better relationship with God than they had before. And it shows in many of the ways that their faith continues. They never ever achieve power like they had before. They're never truly independent from the nations around them. It just doesn't happen. They have no true king, even in the rebellions and the uprisings, even in what we call the Second Temple period. All of that time frame, they are all under the thumb, mostly of Rome. In that time frame, though, their faithfulness is allowed to prosper. Temple service continues uninterrupted in the bulk of that time. Their temple is not sacked nor destroyed, even when they rebel against the nations around them, and they do, trying to create their independence. They themselves are kept whole. In fact, even so much expansion takes place that there's a softening of the edge between Israel and Rome to levels of intermarriage that Nehemiah would have been bothered by, that Ezra would have been bothered by. Their power kind of pulsates from there. All right, so before we go into the email you guys got from Sunday, from earlier in the week, any thoughts on thinking about the reconstruction of Jerusalem before the pop quiz? I don't know if it's a pop quiz, if I give you the quiz in advance, but we'll call it that. I think it's lesson 40 or 35 or so in your printed workbooks if you're using that. All right. The machine says go forward. All right, so when we're thinking about, for our first choice here, Cyrus, which empire is under the rule of Cyrus? Let's go, brains. You've had a good 30 minutes post-caffeination to join us. What you got? Everyone's looking, they're looking.
Persia.
And so we've got the Medo-Persian eventually empire that shows up. This is the one that shows up in our Bible readings from time to time, and we struggle to say his name properly. It's spelt, I think, 3 different ways in prominent English translations. Now, here's my little pro tip for you for that. If you find out that different Bible translations change the spelling of a name, that's a clue that it's a hard name to speak. Like if they've got to use like 4 or 5 different ways to try to spell it for you into English, that's like, it's not easy. And that happens with a few of them. Like Maher Halal Shashbash, that's one of them. Or in this case, Nebuchadnezzar. The DN combo always messes me up. And it's spelled differently in other sections. But which kingdom is he over the head of? Yep, he's over what might be called the New Babylonian Empire, or Babylonia. This one's not too bad. Tilgath-Pileser. It's probably not so bad because it's a shorter set of names with a hyphenation. It's the beginning of the school year right now, so all your kids probably have told you of people in their classes that have interesting spellings for the names of their classmates. Same kind of feeling, I think, to a certain degree. But who's he over? Here's the map. Here's the clue. It's nice and small. Assyrian Empire. And then Sennacherib is our next option, as well as Belshazzar, Sargon, Nabonidus, Cambyses, and Artaxerxes. They are all part of the last empire that leads even to Xerxes. They're all clumped together. That's what you got. They're all Babylonian, so they're all the whole clump of things. They kind of group together in various ways. Xerxes, though, is the Babylonian king. Xerxes and Artaxerxes connect well to Esther, kind of tying these things together. So it kind of gives you a time frame. Let's shift again and think about some major events, just a few of them. When did God kill 185,000 soldiers in what night, and what empire endured that loss? This is in 2 Kings 19. You're very close. Very close. Looking at Assyria, this also includes one of the last major campaigns inside of Israel proper. We just talked about this one just right now. Esther was made queen of, remember it occurred in Babylon and Assyrian spaces, but she was the queen of Persia. Daniel served in the palace during these two empires. First one's easy, Babylon. Second one's Persia. You think about how long his reign was, and the fact that he was able to do so as the Babylonian kingdom and the Persian kingdom. Remember his position gets in question there in the middle of it, and there's this whole uprising story about all that. It's because the world changes around him. There's a lot of textual connections between Daniel's life and Joseph's life and Israel's context there as well. Nehemiah was cupbearer to the king of Persia. All right, Sheshbazzar, one of the individuals identified in the text of Ezra. What kingdom was in place then? Thinking it through. That's Persia. My first step there. Nehemiah built the walls of Jerusalem during the reign of Persia as well. Samaria fell during the Assyrian Empire. Samaria is part of the greater Palestinian region. Jerusalem was burned to the ground by... There's a twofold answer to this one, depending on how broad you wanted to think your brain to go. Babylon was the ones who did it physically. God allows it to happen and had brought them into play, and it's not the only time it happens. If you go forward in time in antiquity to approximately AD 70, it occurs again there. Skipping forward a little bit. When did God fulfill his promise to Abraham to make his nation great? Now we're thinking back a little bit. According to the scriptures, when does that happen? Was it come out of captivity? It does. Remember, this occurs when they are let go from Egypt. This is the fulfillment of this part of the prophecy. And then when does he give the land of Canaan to his seed? Well, think about this from Joshua. That's when they possess the land. All right? Even though we acknowledge when we read the story of Joshua and Judges that there were pockets of the land that weren't truly occupied the way that they should have, the Bible accounts to, this is now your land. This is now yours. You're now responsible for it. You're now accountable for it. I know we all love these. So we got 6 minutes? 4 minutes? 6 minutes. I don't even have a clock in the back because I got less. I don't even want one. I'd be distracted by it like a squirrel. This way I can just ask less. All right, in our list here, what is the first event? Think it through. If you got it in your printed form and then you've got it here above, I want you to start working on that because I'm going to gradually reveal these in order as they occurred. "12 steps take us from Abraham to the return. 12 steps from Abraham receiving his promises to the point at which, essentially, we're now in a holding pattern, right? Because the next major biblical event is the arrival of the Messiah. 12 steps bring us from one to the other. All right, so thinking it again. Who was the prophet who was sent to warn the Assyrians? And he didn't really want to do it. He was very despondent about this choice. Threw himself into the sea, threw himself everywhere. Jonah, right? Jonah is our answer for that. Who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem?
Nehemiah.
Nehemiah. here's the way to lock in your brain. How is it someone knee-high to a Maya can build a wall, right? That's the way you can put it in your brain if you want to have a little mnemonic for it. This little knee-high guy built a wall. He led the process. And so he was able to rebuild the casement walls, which, by the way, the walls of Jerusalem are casement style in that they have exterior rock and then debris and stuff gets put in the middle of it to strengthen it, which becomes the main style of walls built by the Roman Empire. The same casement walls were built throughout the entire history of Rome. The prophet who said God left the temple and Jerusalem. It's a little hint there from the text, right? Ezekiel. We've mentioned her a couple of times, but who is the queen who saved her people in absence of the Bible telling us that God was involved? Esther, right. That's important to think about this last aspect. This is our closing comment for today. The story of Esther is one of the strongest illustrations of how to think about your faith today. We have the scriptures speaking to us, and at times even through us, and we tell it to others. But in absence of having a living prophet, our relationship to God is much like hers would have been. We have to trust that God's word is true. His message is true. And since the story doesn't reveal to us any insight that any of the potentially living prophets or scribes and leaders of the time interacted with her, she is absolutely moving in ways that are purely focused on trust. She does not trust in her wiles or guiles. She's not worried about looking or dressing a certain way in that sense. Because she could have, but she rejected that plan. She saw that played out anyway. She trusts in whatever God has in store for her is the right thing to do. That's just something that I think all of us can equate and think, yeah, that's me. That's how I live a lot of my life, having to trust that God's plan is the right direction. All right, we'll stop our review right there and give our brains a chance to kind of capture ourselves back together again. But I want to thank everyone for their presence and their attention this morning. We'll continue in our study of the history and geography of the Bible story. We'll be talking specifically next week about the period of silence and what's going on in the Roman Empire in the advance of the arrival of Christ. Thanks, everybody.